Everybody's having a fabulous Wednesday. We're going to do another little story chat with myself here, Sergio, and I want to talk about a little bit of technique this time, and this way we can get into the nitty-gritty of what we need to do when we're setting up our files and kind of are getting into it with our story sequences. I also want to take your questions, so if you guys have any questions out there, anything that's pressing on your mind, maybe you saw a cool movie, share that with us. Maybe you're working on a cool sequence, also share that with us. Maybe your struggles and maybe some of your successes. I think that would be really fun to hear, and we can share that with the group and everybody on here. I did just right off the bat want to do a little bit of an announcement. There's some amazing activity going on in our Visual Storytellers United Facebook group. For those of you guys who are in the visual story course, you're going to see some of that there, but there's some other work that people are posting just on the jobs that they're doing, even some like updates on portfolios. Super inspiring stuff. So I encourage you guys to just check that out. And you have to click to add yourself to that group, but it's pretty straightforward. And yeah, I think it's good for networking, right? It's another thing that's really important that we talk about a lot with storyboard art and just your career in general, is have a really good solid network of people that you're talking with, and making sure that you can like bounce ideas back and forth from people, and know what jobs are going on out there. When things are dry as far as like leads that you're getting, that's when you want to lean on your network. It's kind of like the time right now because there's a lot of uncertainty. We don't know what's going to happen in the future. That's why you want to lean on the guys that you have, that maybe in the business that are working already. And if you don't know anybody, well, start connecting with people on LinkedIn, connect with us on social media, hit us up at Storyboard Art, go to the website, sign up for free. That's why we're there, all right? You don't have to spend any money. It's a resource. That's part of why we set this up, because it was so hard for me to get started in this career. And, all the help that we had coming up was just trying to figure out what to do. And that's why we set this up. So there's some free resources there. And then also you can see the classes and stuff if you're interested for that kind of thing. Cool. Good shout out to everybody. I'm glad you guys are joining us again. It's great to see some familiar faces here. Let me just start real quick, and then I want to take your questions. So if you have any questions, go ahead and chat that in. Any comments, anything that you're working on. Like I said before, if you have a cool movie, if you have a cool sequence, share that with us. I think that's a really good thing, that at least we're getting inspired in this quick half hour that we're going to do this chat for. I did want to say a little bit about technique, because that's kind of what I want to talk about today. And let's talk about file setup. I recently sent out, or I made public, a kind of my method of setting up Photoshop for doing storyboards. And this is totally a personal thing. This is not, because everybody has a different way of doing it in Photoshop. I like to use the timeline, and I like to do something that's sequential art. And Photoshop is a very common program that everybody's using. So I set this out, and there's some good back and forth comments going on there of other people who have different tricks. And then I let people, I uploaded my presets and my action commands, so you can use those too and maybe adjust those. So you don't have to use them just as they are. You can go ahead and modify them for what you're doing, okay? And that's always great. So at any rate, I use a template. So you can go to our YouTube page and our YouTube channel, and you can see that video, or go to Storyboard Art, you can see that post. And it's basically a quick video of me setting up a file in Photoshop and doing a quick demo. And one of the things that I use all the time is a template. And that template, of course, you can download that on the Storyboard Art page and even on that post as well. But it's a simple template that anybody can make, really. And it's using the 16:9 aspect ratio. Now, there's a couple common aspect ratios that we want to talk about. And if you guys have no idea what I'm talking about, the aspect ratio is how rectangular or how square your image is, right? That's basically all that means. And it's the side of the image versus the top and bottom of the image. So horizontal versus vertical, that's the aspect ratio. The common ones that you've heard of, and it's like on your phone and on movies and Netflix and stuff, is the widescreen 16:9 aspect ratio. Most things right now are being produced in 16:9. And when I say most things, it's like YouTube videos, commercials, even some movies. are in 16 by 9 aspect ratio. That's the widescreen. Um, there's You can get really technical with this. There's a ton of aspect ratios, 185, 178, 235, 16 by 9. So all of these numbers, again, if you have no idea what I'm talking about, forget it. All you need to know is that it's a widescreen, it's rectangular instead of square. Okay, 16 by 9 is the length of the frame versus the width of the frame. Wait, did I say that right? The height of the frame versus the width of the frame is what that is. Now, there's another common one that I like to use, and use this on Clone Wars and Lucasfilm, was the 2:3:5 aspect ratio, which is widescreen, ultra widescreen, which is kind of like Lawrence of Arabia, and certainly the classic Star Wars was shot in 2:3:5, Indiana Jones, etc. Those are like an ultra widescreen. It's very rectangular, and it's really cool to compose in an aspect ratio like that. So that's what you want to start with. You always want to start with a frame. That's really important. And I think people sometimes miss that, is that you need something that's a bounding box to start your composition. Now, programs like Toon Boom automatically have a preset there. So it's actually even easier. Like I'm talking Photoshop where you have to load up a file and have some kind of template ready to go. But in something like Photoshop, you're not going to have the set presets, but in Toon Boom, you have those storyboard presets, and those are working well, right? So that's a good program to use. It's already set up for storyboards. There's more programs out there like Sketchbook Pro, and there's one called Storyboarder, Procreate, et cetera, et cetera. So there's many out there. Don't get hung up on the technique. Just understand that you need a bounding box to fill your composition. And what I personally like to do is have my bounding box smaller than my actual canvas that I'm working on, right? Hopefully you understand the terms I'm talking about. The canvas size is much larger, and within that I have a square frame that's on a separate layer. I usually lock that layer so that actual frame I won't be able to draw over or adjust, okay? And it's there as a guide. And then on another layer underneath that frame, I'll start drawing, okay? And that's basically just a quick and dirty way of doing the setup. In terms of the canvas, so again, a program like Toon Boom already has this taken care of. It's going to have whatever ratio, aspect ratio you choose as you start the program, because it gives you a certain presets, either HD or 4K or whatever it is that you're working on, and then you just start working. The canvas is already larger and infinite compared to your actual frame. That's a cool advantage of using a program like Toon Boom. Okay, so you don't have to worry about all of this. There's always a learning curve with this software, but you just want to make sure you have the right setup. Okay, that's the first thing I want to cover there. The next one I want to mention is organization and file structure. And so I can talk a lot about this, but the one important thing I want to mention here is your naming convention. I really get, let's say, into the details of the naming convention, because that's something super important. When it's basically how you name your file is what that means, right? And it's important on a production, and I also like to do it on a personal level. Any personal job, like say I'm doing a freelance thing where they haven't set up a naming convention, I will ask them if they need a naming convention, but I will name my files pretty much the way I've been accustomed to naming files through the different studios I've worked at, because I feel like that logic works for me a lot of ways. And the reason it's important is if you go back to a file that you started years ago, right? I'm talking things that you worked on 5, maybe even 10 years ago, and you go back and you open up that folder, you're going to get completely lost if you start doing random naming conventions. You'll start doing like, first sketch, 1, rough draft part 2, and version 12. Like it's all over the place. So what I've done is just kind of standardize the way that I work with my files. That way, anytime in the future, I'm usually not going to change my naming convention. And I haven't for at least the last 10 years. I've basically done the same thing. What I do is I do a category. So this is going to get into the weeds here, but just to show you how anal I get with my files, I talk about category, subject, version number, and then anything else at the end of that file, and I'll separate each one of those with an underscore, so it's all one complete, structured phrase, let's say. And then of course the file is extension, so it could be a Toon Boom file, Photoshop file, JPEG, whatever. But that .jpg at the end. That's the extension. Usually that's standard, so I don't mess with that. But the actual file. So for example, I'll do something like I'm working on a film right now. So it starts with the name of the film, alien country underscore whatever the subject is that I'm working on. It could be Act 1, Sequence 12, right? And I'll actually write all that out. Underscore again, thumbnail storyboards, which is again the category describing what's going on. Thumbnail storyboards, rough pass storyboards, whatever you want to name it. I usually just do thumbnails and storyboards as like my rough versus my kind of cleanup. Underscore again and the version numbers, and I usually do leading zeros. Okay, so 01, 02, 03, 04, and the reason why is that it'll automatically organize the way you're viewing these files inside your folder structure. That I get really anal about, because the other thing is, if you hand these files off to somebody else, one, that they should be able to understand what you're handing off to them just by reading the file, and then the folder structure also stays intact. Okay, so you'd have reference on another thing, you'd have in another file, you'd have the different versions of your storyboard passes in a different folder. That kind of thing is the way to do it, right? Organization is really important because it comes down to efficiency. If you can do this really fast and you save your brain power on something that is much more important, which is the actual sequence and the work that you're working on, that's where you want to do it. Okay, that's what you want to spend your brain power on, not on folder structures and files. I do the same thing for exports as well. I make sure that the exports work well. If you're working in a studio environment, most of the time they have this set up for you, and you will, you're required to adapt the way that you export your files in a certain way, because it gets sent to the editorial department. It might get sent to, animation and layout departments. And you want to make sure that your naming conventions and your file structure is the way that the studio requires it. So that's all pipeline stuff, but it's really important when it comes down to storyboards, because we are the first. We're the first people that usually start on a production, and just the idea phase and the design phase of this is really, really important to set the tone for the rest of the production. Okay, cool. Hopefully there's some things that you guys are already doing, and maybe have a better way of doing it. Let us know. So also, I want to take your questions. If anybody has any questions or stuff, let me know, and we'll jump in on it. So I just want to say hi to everybody too. So this is awesome. Let me take a question here from Amira. How can apps on mobile phones help us to do a storyboard? I haven't experimented that much with drawing on my actual phone, although I have like a fancy pen. Here it is. I can show you. Let me bring this up to the camera. You see this tip on here? This is a thing I got on Amazon for like maybe $10, maybe $5 to $10. I don't remember. Here's the lid. It's called, I'll just show you the brand. I got this a while ago, so I don't even know if they exist. Sometimes these brands like come and go. Hopefully that's in focus. And anyway, this tip is like your fingertip. So if you touch it on the screen, and it even has like a more detailed point one that these aren't that accurate. So drawing on your phone is kind of a pain in the ass. I'd much rather draw on a tablet that's meant for drawing, like an iPad or a Wacom tablet. But hey, in a pinch, if you really need to do this, you could do that. As far as apps, I would probably, again, I'm not an expert on this, so if any of you guys have experience with this stuff, but like I would say download Procreate. I think you can do that on your phone even. Photoshop has a simplified version that you can do there, and I think Sketchbook, Autodesk Sketchbook as well. And they probably are pretty good for that. Again, I usually just, if I'm going to do it on my phone, I'd rather just do it on paper, on my sketchbook, personally, because I can whip out some wicked thumbnails in my sketchbook really quick, and then I'll just take a picture with my phone. So that's one way you can do it. And then I also have like Adobe Acrobat on my phone, and I can make a PDF out of it, beam it to whoever client. That's a good way to quick sketch. Maybe you guys out there have some tips about how to do that, so that in a pinch you can use your phone if you really need to send stuff that way. Cool. This is great, Chad. I'm going to answer your question. Chad is asking on Facebook about the naming conventions and how far out should your leading zeros go for your naming convention. So when I say leading zeros, just to remind you what that means, at the end of the file, and this is usually the best way to do it, is at the end of the file is to add a bunch of leading zeros for your exports and also for your file structure. So for example, if you're going to export a sequence of JPEG images, that's a ton of storyboards, it could be hundreds of panels, and you can do this in many programs, Photoshop, Toon Boom, etc. You want to do leading zeros based on the number of panels you do. I usually do 3 because I don't usually go into the thousands for my storyboard sequences. Okay, most of the time it's in the hundreds for a really big sequence, and like a really big sequence would be 300, 400, 500 panels at the most. I think at one time I got to 600 panels which would be 600 individual images, something to like that, with a really large sequence that had a lot of poses. It was really, elaborated out, kind of this animation story style. And then what I would do is just 3 leading zeros: 0, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then when you get to the hundreds, it goes 101, 102, 3, 4, 5, and it automatically organizes itself. So I usually do 3. If you can do 4 if you really get into the weeds of animation, but I think 3 you'd be fine. This is another great question. So coming up from Avi Johnsay, I think. Hopefully I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Thanks, buddy. Quick question. Now that Lightbox Expo is just online, are you guys planning on doing something special for that weekend? Absolutely. I'm glad you asked. And yes, we've been in contact with Lightbox Expo people. They sent us a message today about some of the, probably to everybody. I'm sure they got a bunch of messages, but since we're one of the sponsors, they reached out to us and let us know that Lightbox Expo for this year is going online, right? And so we primarily have an online platform. So whether or not we partner with Lightbox Expo and some of the organization we've been talking about, even at the in-person event, doing some talks. Now that we're going online, hopefully we can continue that discussion. And I have some great ideas. But even on our own, as a platform that we have online, we're going to plan some really great stuff. And so keep an eye out for some of those announcements. We have a bunch of cool things going for as far as like guest speakers and just workshops and things that we can do to collaborate together. I certainly want to make myself available for that as well. So if you guys have any ideas or any requests, now's the time to give us that info, and we can start planning. So anything that you have on your mind for Lightbox Expo, it is now going to be an online event, which is actually kind of a good thing right now because it's going to have much more reach for everybody out there in the art world. Cool. Let me scan some Instagram stuff. So let me answer this question and see if I can digest this. So Silentium absolutum. Let me answer your question. Can you explain the difference in between storyboards for movies and animation 2D? So I think let me see if I get this right. You're asking the difference between maybe live action movies, which have actors, versus animation, 2D animation, or maybe even 3D animation storyboards. There is a difference, and actually sometimes the lines are getting blurred depending on the production you're working on, because I've seen really elaborate animatics for like the Marvel movies, and those are continuity boards that are really fleshed out, that have tons of poses, and they are a very precise blueprint of what the final shots will be in storyboard form. So in kind of 2D or maybe in the previs form, that's the way they do it. So most of the time, traditionally what has happened is live action storyboards have been kind of concept boards / idea generation for the filmmakers, for the director, cinematographer, and kind of the visual people involved. They will conceptualize the scene with a storyboard artist, and not every they're not necessarily continuity boards. They don't have to be fleshed out 100%. The reason why is because when you actually get on set, you may not have the same conditions that you thought you were going to have when you actually planned out the storyboards. Remember, the storyboards come really early in the production process. So you might not have sets built, you might not know the exact location, you're just coming up with an idea for an event. This is the traditional way you do it. So then you'd put arrows, you kind of describe the general action, what you're doing in a sequence. And most of the time, the sequences that you'd be doing in a live action film would be kind of elaborate action sequences, not necessarily the dialogue stuff. Dialogue interaction is usually handled by the director and the cinematographer on the set. They just block it out because it's actually not that logistically difficult to block out a dialogue scene with actors, because you kind of know what you're going to do. If you have a complicated series of shots that you really need to block out, that's where you get your story guys involved, right? Now, the difference between animation boards is that most of the time in animated films, 2D or 3D, you have to create a very elaborate story reel that has all of the continuity of each and every shot in there, and within the shot, key acting poses for your characters. The reason you do this is so you can put this up on the story reel and you can analyze with the editorial department if the scenes are working correctly. Okay, that's the main difference. And there are techniques for doing both. And I recommend that you, as a story guy, you should learn them all. It's going to take some time, but focus on what you're good at and also what you want to get into. But then eventually you can branch out and do other things. You need to be physically capable artistically to be able to handle all of that subject matter. Okay, cool. And then actually, this is a really good follow-up question. So Joseph Garcia here is asking, in your opinion, is timing also part of the duty of a storyboard artist? Yes, it is. I think it is. I think you want to make sure that you have proper and accurate timing for your shots. The reason why I say that is because the trend now is going towards creating animatics with your storyboard sequences. A program like Toon Boom Storyboard Pro allows you to directly create the animatic and export a movie file, a movie sequence of your storyboard sequence that has been timed out. And that's kind of your first pass. The reason I like that is I prefer that because you, like I've said many times, you're kind of like a mini director as a story guy. And you want to take ownership of your scene and you want to give the first intention of what you conceptualize for that scene with timing. And you might even have scratch dialogue. You might even have the dialogue, the final dialogue from the actors. If you're working on an animated show, they'll record that first, and then based on the script, you can actually time it out to the dialogue track. And then that usually gets sent to the editorial department. So you've already timed out your sequences with the poses, and that way you're editing and creating the sequence as you go. That's where you become like a mini director. So yeah, timing is important. You can just in your career and the particular jobs that you get, you may not have to worry about that, depending on what kind of jobs and clients. If you're doing more commercial work or live action stuff that they don't care about creating a story reel, then you just don't have to worry about timing. I recommend that you learn like timing and animation and comedic timing. This is where I feel like 2D animation skills are super important when it comes to being a board artist, because if you know about squash and stretch and the actual timing and delivery and when things should hit their marks, you will have a better command of your scenes that way. And I think I've said this many times, is that I always think that 2D, maybe I'm biased, of course I started as a 2D animator, but I think 2D animators make really strong story artists. And I don't say that because I think I'm any good. It's because I've seen other people who are excellent animators, and then they transition into doing story work, and their story work is really good too. And they just know timing, they know animation, they know movement, they know shot flow, how to make things really good. And certainly draftsmanship as an animator, you have to have really good drawing skills, 2D animator at least. And so when you translate that into storyboards, yeah, it's great. I just got sent, a friend of mine is working on a production. He's like a longtime 2D animator, but he got hired to do story work, and he sent me a sequence, and I was like, wow, yeah, awesome. And that goes to prove my point that he's like such a really good draftsman and animator that his sequence was really strong. So anyway, cool. Let me go back to Instagram and see what else we got here. Great questions. Hopefully this stuff is relevant for you guys. Great to see everybody too. Some familiar faces on there. Let me go to Tim here. He's asking about Lightbox. Thanks, buddy. Good to see you. He's asking, will our 2019 Lightbox talk be available online anytime? Yeah, I believe so. I think what I know from the Lightbox people is that they did record that talk, and they're releasing those videos as they have them. I don't know if they're doing them in any particular order. We have like mini clips that people in the audience and also some of our crew from Storyboard Art who were there kind of like took some video clips, and I'll see if we can dig those up and publish those. They're not complete, so you might just get like sound bites here and there. But it was a really fun talking about story, of course, at Lightbox Expo. And I was actually really humbled that it was like one of the first talks in the first day. And I just remember there, I was like, man, I think I'm going to go to an empty room. And I show up, there was a line out the door of people wanting to talk story. And I was like, yeah, this is awesome. People, I feel like the story artists, that because this is becoming a discipline that is much, it's getting better known. Like back in the day, the only people knew about animation or animators or story people was that like they were like visual effects artists or animators. And so they became those guys. They didn't realize that they're story artists, and they've been around for many, many years. I just don't think they got the credit or the limelight like they had in the past. So this is becoming much more common, and people are trying to get into this, specifically into this discipline, which I really love. And I think we're starting to see that. That's why we're getting a lot of attention, and not just me. I mean, there were other panels and talks that filled up, like Tim Burgard's panel, and I think Benton Ju and Anson Ju were there too, and also Nate Stanton, who's a ex-Pixar guy, gave a really great talk, and that was like packed at Lightbox. So there's a really good stuff going on from really talented people. In fact, I will say I'm actually doing another talk for Anamayo, which is it's a European and Spanish-based animation expo that we're doing an online chat with them. So if you go to anamayo.com, which is AMAIYO.com, if I'm spelling that right, and you can check out that on there. Right. Cool. So let me read some of these questions here. This is a great follow-up question from Avi here. So he's mentioning that during a portfolio review, somebody from Sony told him last year that their boards look better for live action versus animation. And he was really confused by that statement. Can you enlighten what style of drawing leans more towards live action versus animated? So in kind of talking about the difference between live action film and animation. So live action boards have traditionally been, like I said, conceptualizations of the scenes. There's a lot more detail in the panels. So you're going to spend more time in rendering up and creating a complete illustration. This is, again, traditionally what it's been. Not every production does this because I'm seeing a lot of like overlap and there's blurry lines between the two of them. But what I want to say here is probably why somebody from a studio mentioned this comment to you was that most likely you're probably rendering up your panel with a lot of lighting and a lot of technique and shading and things like that. A lot of extra detail that you would most likely leave out if you're doing this for animation. For animation, you need a really strong pose, a really strong composition, but with simplified line work. And the reason why is because that drawing of a simplified line work with just a few tones, flat tones, gray tones, will look much better in a story reel, and it's much more readable at an instant in a story reel than a fully rendered panel. And try it yourself. Like if you look at a really complicated painting, you have to actually look at it and stare at it. in order to understand what's going on, because there's so much detail. Your eye and your mind gets overwhelmed by the detail. But if you simplify this down into silhouettes and really strong poses and strong shapes, and this is part of like having really good drawing shortcuts and good silhouette, and you do this for a whole sequence, you're not overwhelmed by the detail. What you are focusing on is the action, the dialogue, and the poses of the characters, and the camera moves, etc. And then that's really the meat of what you're doing, and that's how you create a story reel with continuity boards inside of animation. So hopefully that that makes a little bit of sense, right? Cool. So I think this is probably a good time to end it, but let me take a couple more questions here. Hey Joe, what's happening, buddy? So we've got a question from 11 Joe. How often should we draft drawings for blocking a scene before we board out a sequence? Is it apart from the process or just special circumstances? So I think what you're, let me see if I get this right. What you're referring to is like how many preliminary sketches or rough drawings you should be doing before you actually commit and block out a storyboard scene. Now, if I've interpreted that question right, it really depends on your on the project and your own personal style and thinking process. I suggested, I showed people, and then, Joe, you're part of the mentorship, and this is one of the things I showed people, my method of doing it. It doesn't have to be the method. I just landed on the way that works best for me. I know many people do different styles. So what I do is I will do a lot of research, and I'll sketch on the side of paper and drawings and different things. And and here we go. And Richard, the cat here, comes to help and give me advice here too. But so basically, what happens is I'll do a bunch of sketches, research, and then just like thumbnail drawings, and I'll do that on a separate canvas or separate file, sheet of paper, whatever, however I'm working. Then I'll do a rough pass. All right, Richard, thanks. Then I'll do a rough pass with thumbnails. And that rough pass, because I've already done my research and already know about kind of how I'm going to take the sequence, I can usually do that thumbnail pass with a little bit more confidence. Now, keep in mind the thumbnail passes are really small drawings that are very, very simplified with only line work, very little shading, because I'm not wasting time on rendering or drawing technique. I'm thinking about story, shot composition, wide shot versus close-up versus different camera moves, high angle versus low angle, and then I'll thumbnail out the whole sequence. And you'll see some of my thumbnails. I'll scratch out things. I'll erase it. Most of the time now, what I'll do is I'll do my thumbnails, and I can just shrink down the camera size in my digital setup, and it's almost like I'm drawing on a small thumbnail page, but it's at the full resolution. So when I'm ready, I can blow that up, and then I can already go in and clean it up. So I'll do the reference pass, let's say, which is quick. It might take just an hour or two just to do some reference, depending on how complicated the sequence is. Sometimes you have to look at a lot of movie reference and stuff to get your ideas straight. Then I'll do a thumbnail pass. That usually takes a long time. I'll usually spend at least 1, 2, 3 days on thumbnails, right? And to really get that right, I'll move things around, I'll change it up. If I don't like the way it's working, I'll start again and do it. Get those thumbnails correct where I can see it and I can feel it's working well. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to commit to blowing up those thumbnails and cleaning up those boards into something that's a little more presentable. So theoretically, it's like a reference pass, just doing research and whatever, doing a rough pass, which is my thumbnails, and then doing a kind of a cleanup pass. And I'll do any combination of those depending on the complexity of the job, which means, for example, if I have no time and it's a really, really tight deadline, what I'm going to do is I'm going to simplify my final storyboards so they're almost like pseudo thumbnails. So I make sure that my thumbnails are really tight to be able to just immediately hand that off to the client. So I'm doing this at a really fast pace. If I have more time, I'll rough out my thumbnails real quick, but then I'll spend more time in doing my cleanup boards, right? Hopefully that makes sense. All right, fellas, this is a great chat. I hope some of this stuff inspires you and keeps you sharp. If you have any ideas or any any methods that you think would be helpful, by all means, please share that with us. Share that with the group and post your method of doing things. I would love to see it. I like to get inspired by how other people do stuff. It's all a process. So whatever I'm doing today may not be the way I'm doing it tomorrow, and we all have to be learning from each other. So just because I say one thing doesn't mean it's the way you should do it. You should try it and see if my advice helps you in any way, but then eventually create your own process of doing it. I know guys who when they board, they don't do the thumbnail path. They go directly to doing your boards and they just knock it out. But they have years of experience behind them to be able to do that. I find that most people starting out though will get lost if they don't properly plan out their sequence. That's why I highly recommend a structured method of doing it. But again, share any topics or tips with us. And I love the idea of if any of you guys have any suggestions for things that you want to look for in the upcoming Lightbox, we're going to be there, and we're definitely going to be there online. So I look forward to seeing all of you guys there as well. All right, awesome. Have a great rest of your evening, and we'll see you. Hopefully we can schedule one of these again on Friday, 7 p.m. Pacific time. All right, guys, take care. We'll see ya. Good luck with everything.